call us to order. So I'm calling us to order for the Executive Committee, and may we start with the roll call?
Yes, thank you. Chair Tyson?
Here.
Director Gibbons?
Here.
Elahi?
Present.
Martinez Beltran?
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum, and I will note that Vice Chair Fliger is currently absent.
She is just here now.
Here, Andrea.
Great, thanks so much, everybody.
No problem.
Our timing was very good. All right, we'll move on to public comment. And so the public may provide comments on any item, on any matter not on the agenda. Do we have any public comments? Any the public that wishes to speak? I do not see any response, so I'm going to close that. And in that case, let's move on to the consent item, and that is approving the minutes of February 25th. Do we have any discussion?
I move approval of the minutes.
Thank you, Liz.
Second.
Second from Yvonne. Thank you very much. Any discussion? With that, let's do a roll call vote.
Yeah. Chair Tyson?
Yes.
Vice Chair Fliger?
Yes.
Director Gibbons?
Aye.
Elahi?
Aye.
Martinez Beltran?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries unanimously.
Great, and thank you. And by the way, let me just mention, I thought that the minutes were very well written, and it was quite clear what happened when I left. And so that's the main reason I wanted to read those, to make sure that I knew that Director Fliger could handle that baton as well as she did. With that, let's move on to our regular calendar, and I mean the consent calendar, and that would be, oh, we just did that, excuse me, I'm sorry. And so our regular calendar and the CEO's report.
Thank you, Chair Tyson. I have a couple of items. One is we will be sending an email out to you, most likely today, about Earth Day and celebrating our 5-year anniversary. So the event will be held in association with Cupertino's Earth and Arbor Day Festival on Saturday, April 23rd from 11 to 3. And then we're going to have a reception after that for current board members and alternates, past board members and alternates, the MOG, and several other folks who have been involved in our formation and support. So you should be seeing that. We'll have a reception also in Cupertino. Board Chair Gibbons will be speaking, and so will Director Willie will also be speaking. I also mentioned to you at the last meeting, we're going to do some realignment and reorganization at SVCE. So we've been working with the team on that, and we'll be talking to staff next week, but we've been discussing and getting input from the management team. So some slight changes of basically getting all the programs related work under the decarbonization group, and then policy and regulatory work combined with the energy procurement group. So I will provide the board more information at the regular board meeting. That is the end of my report. Thank you, Chair Tyson.
I muted myself, sorry. Thank you, Girish. Do we have any questions or comments for our CEO? I do not see any. And so let's move on then to item number 3, which is an update on the potential plans for return to in-person board committee meetings, and we have a staff presentation. Take it away, Kevin, I think.
Thank you, Chair Tyson. Good morning, members of the committee. Yes, we'd like to talk to you today about the changes in the landscape for returning to in-person board and committee meetings, and most notably with regards to preparations for hybrid meetings moving forward. Next slide, please. So currently, as you know, AB 361 has allowed local governments to take advantage of relaxed guidelines around noticing for remote meetings, and those are what we're taking advantage of today. It was enacted in September of last year and is in effect through January 1st of 2024. But it is dependent on there being a state of emergency in place. And as I'm sure you've heard from your member agencies and are experiencing as well, that remains in place for now, but once that sunsets, we will be required to go back to the previous noticing requirements in the Brown Act. Next slide, please. So without those relaxed abilities, we would need to, of course, notice remote locations in advance, and then make those remote locations open and accessible to the public, which of course creates some logistical complications. Next slide, please. There is pending legislation to, of course, help with this process. AB 1944, which I believe the ad hoc committee has pledged support for, is to allow no noticing for private locations so long as the public remains able to teleconference in. SB 1100, which we've also pledged to support, would allow public agencies to remove disruptive audience members individually. So that's a minor adjustment. And then there's one, it's kind of on our watch list right now, which is AB 2449. And that would have, as it says there, allow for relaxed teleconferencing requirements if a quorum is present in one location. But my understanding from our legislative staff, Bennett Chang, is that there are some complications in how this might actually be evidenced with regards to a quorum and having members present, not present, arriving, and just sort of the specifics around how that might be implemented that we have some questions around. So there are potential changes coming, and we will continue to monitor these. Next slide. With all of that in mind, we are, as I said at the beginning, preparing for the reality that hybrid meetings will occur at some point, as you've been experiencing through your own member agencies. As you know, we usually held meetings in person at Cupertino Community Hall, and that community was pretty cautious and conservative over the last few months during the Omicron surge with regards to hosting any public meetings. And so that has not been an option until just now, and they are resuming in-person meetings starting in April. So we are going to work with them to prepare for that. We are also in the process of confirming and securing equipment and vendors to outfit our office space conference rooms, our two large conference rooms and our small conference rooms, so that we'd be able to host board committee meetings here at the office. And those would be, of course, public meetings. And as a result, we would kind of need to think about the use of the office, accessibility to the public, masking and noticing requirements, all of those things. But that's a second option as well. And then the sort of final element of the hybrid meeting setup is that if we end up in a position where the state of emergency is lifted, Brown Act requirements return, and we do need to notice remote locations for those participating remotely, our proposal, and this would be to reach out to each of your member communities, is to have SVCE reimburse for any time or fees that are applicable if a board member or committee member chooses to participate from a member agency location that has those costs associated with it. Those are accessible locations. They could be easily noticed. They would not intrude upon the personal privacy of your home. So we think that's a solution we could very readily work with staff on at all of the locations to help make that a reality. Next slide, please. So, if those Brown Act requirements return, as I said, the locations must be accessible and allow full public participation. They must be noticed in advance. They'd be for both board and committee meetings. One element, of course, is that they don't need to be the same for every meeting. So you could participate as you do now from one location for a board meeting, separate location from a committee meeting, but they do need to meet all of those existing Brown Act requirements. And so that's part of our suggestion and recommendation for participating from an existing publicly accessible location, if at all possible. Next slide. As I mentioned, with that, we would be happy to cover any fees for staff time or reservation fees to utilize those facilities for remote participation for SVCE board and committee members. We will obviously do our best to, assist with technical setups, work with staff to make sure things are working beforehand so that everything runs smoothly. But obviously, being a small organization, we'll be focused on working with the in-person staff at location for, the in-person portion of a hybrid meeting. Well, we'd love to send, Nick and Andrea and Lisa and myself around. It would just be tough. So we'll do our best to help remotely and to work with staff on site to make sure that's all set up and running well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the schedule, we have a meeting date set up with Cupertino staff for the 6th of April. And we're going to go there and test the hybrid setup with a Zoom room setup that they have in place so that we're familiar with it. We totally believe that they've got it down, but we want to work smoothly with them so that we're prepared for that. And then we will reach out to all board and committee members to start discerning sort of what preferences are, should we find ourselves in this situation with Brown Act noticing requirements back in place, just so that we're, again, prepared for that eventuality. We're proposing right now that we target May for an initial hybrid board meeting to invite people to come in if they wish, participate remotely if they wish, but make that our first agency effort to engage in a hybrid meeting together. That, of course, is very much open to discussion, and you could let us know if that is a good idea, if you'd like to delay longer. But a starting point for discussion, we think May would give us plenty of time to prepare for that. And then, of course, if the state of emergency remains in place, we wouldn't be under obligation to continue hybrid, but it would be a good experience to get one under our belt as an agency. June is sort of our targeted completion timeline for the conference room upgrades here at our office, at which point we could then begin hosting committee meetings in person here at the office as well. So we're really looking at the next 2 to 3 months before the July break as sort of this preparation and test window. But of course, we'll keep you apprised if anything changes with the state of emergency or any of these elements at any time. I believe that's the last slide. Yes. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion, hear your thoughts, take notes, think about the timeline, and appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Kevin. Let me see who's got any questions or thoughts. Let's start with Vice Chair Flagger.
Thank you, Chair Tyson, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for this presentation, Kevin. It's obviously necessary for us to start thinking about this, and I'm grateful that the staff is way ahead of us with these proposals going all the way out through June. I have not seen that forward thinking with any other organization, so thank you. My question has to do with the remote location assistance, because I want to make sure I understand what SVCE's expectation is of the members if we choose to stay remote. So if we revert to the existing Brown Act requirements, I do understand that if we're meeting remotely, we would still have to post the address. So if we're meeting at our homes, we would have to post our personal address. And so maybe the idea here is if we don't want to, for whatever reason, or can't drive to Cupertino, we would be able to go over to our local city facilities to host the meeting. So that all makes sense. But what I'm not clear on, because when you say assistance, it makes me think SVCE is thinking a bigger production than what's required. So for example, if I want to go over to our community centers, they have different small conference rooms, and just bring my laptop and post on the door of a small conference room, I'm in here, what did I know the notice requirements? That's all I would need, correct? Are you thinking I need to have a big room where members can come in? I mean, audience members can come in. I just want to make sure that's not the expectation.
No, we don't intend to prescribe any set of requirements, much more exactly what you said. Support you in being able to utilize your existing facilities that are convenient to you, that are very noticeable, are not private, that are accessible already. But if even in taking advantage of a 7 to 9 p.m. reservation at a community hall, there's extra staff time involved just in keeping the facility open, we'd be happy to assist with covering that because it's an SVCE board meeting.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. And then Director Gibbons.
Yes, thank you for putting all of these pieces of the puzzle out for discussion. I think my question is, will the office be open? I know staff comes and goes to the office. Is there an expectation that the offices will be open for all of these meetings? So people have the choice to come to the office.
Yes, I mean, we certainly can be. We've been operating on an ad hoc sort of basis.
That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
So, I mean, we'd be happy to continue to keep the office open for all of these meetings if there's interest in attending from this location. Absolutely.
Yeah, because my city doesn't have very good meeting facilities, and what we have are highly in demand. I'm just saying, it will be difficult to find a space during the day. So
the only caveat I will say with that is, again, being a small agency, if we are going to go in person to Cupertino Community Hall, we would just have to balance what staff remained at the office if we're in Cupertino. But I think you're speaking more to committee meetings.
Sorry, thank you for the clarification. Yes, I am thinking specifically about community meetings. Yes.
Yeah, then the office is.
Not community meetings, subcommittee meetings, board, like
Yes.
this meeting.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's just a consideration in your thinking. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then Director Martinez Beltran.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So to Liz's point, then that would mean, would SBCE support us in even subcommittee meetings, meeting remotely as well? Or I guess I just want to dig a little bit deeper on that.
Any of our meetings that would fall under traditional Brown Act noticing requirements, we would be happy to support your attending from a location that is accessible, that again may have some additional costs or efforts involved. That's where we're offering to work with your member agency, or perhaps you and Zach meet in Morgan Hill, or
Right.
any of those iterations to make remote attendance feasible under the guise of those existing noticing requirements, just so you don't have to do your home if you're not comfortable with that.
Okay, great. And wherever you're meeting, as Vice Chair Fliger said, it's nothing more. We're not thinking, I guess I'm just thinking, because it's hybrid and we're talking about going hybrid, does that mean we need to have a certain camera? Are we still able to come in if we're coming remotely? Are we still able to do that with just a laptop?
It's a bit of both. And if you have a setup that you'd like to build out, if you will, we'd be happy to work with you and support that. At the same time, if you want to keep it simple and walk into a small meeting room and be able to get in and get out, then we support, bring the laptop, and we'll of course work with staff to make sure connections work beforehand, but you can keep it very streamlined if that's the most useful thing for you.
Great. And probably end up doing both, but that's great. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that's if the Brown Act stays and things don't change. But if things do change, where we don't have to post where we are publicly, will we then be able to outfit our homes? And again, maybe that's part of the question we just discussed, which is why I was thinking, does this mean we need a dedicated camera? Do we need to have a certain space that's set up anywhere? But it sounds like maybe not. We could just, like in a home office, if we're not having to post our home address, would we need to outfit that space with something additional, was what I wanted to know.
Well, again, and I would say, we're open to both possibilities. So it's what works best for you as a remote attendee. And, we're very hopeful that we will see some movement on legislation that allows us to maintain that. Because I think in the broader landscape, for public agencies, largely, the boon in public participation from remote attendance has been great. And so I think that's often the driving factor in keeping remote attendance open. But obviously for an agency such as ours, or for BACMed or ABAG or MTC, where it's a regional sort of draw, then I think equally as much, it's really beneficial to allow remote participation, given the distances involved. So with all that, yes to both. We're happy to make it work as easily and slimly as possible, not to overcomplicate things. But if we are finding that remote attendance benefits from an additional setup, we're happy to help with that as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Great. Those are very helpful answers, very good questions. And by the way, are you picking up any background noise from my microphone? Great, because frankly, my father-in-law won't wear his hearing aids. Everybody's bellowing in the room next to me, and it's kind of distracting. But I just didn't want it to bother you. So great. Okay, now that I've shared that.
Chair Tyson,
Yes?
I'd just like to remind you that this is being recorded.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have a follow-up comment, if I may.
Okay, go ahead, please do.
Thank you. So I just wanted to try and summarize that the conversation has come around now, so I'm seeing a little bit of distinction. So we have one set of concerns on how to run the main board meeting once a month. And for that situation, if people, under hopefully some additional new rules, people want to be remote for the main board meeting, their address may or may not have to be posted depending on what happens in the legislation.
Correct.
If it's left, you have to post your location. So if you have to post your location and it's your home, you have to decide. But what I heard for the first time is that wherever the board member is, they have to have an accessible space, which I've never had to do before. So it would be reasonable that board members should plan on going to a public facility, ideally their local city hall, rather than doing anything from home. That's what's coming across to me. And then the second part, which is the committee meetings, it's the same thing because they're public meetings and you have to be accessible. And if you have to notice it, you'd have to notice it at your home. The advantage with the committee meetings is they're mostly during the day. The issue will be reserving a space someplace in and making sure that that's all set up. So I think it might be easier to just say it's unlikely that people are going to be able to hold meetings from their homes. I think it's likely that people, whether it's a board meeting or a committee meeting, you're going to likely want to go to a public space. That's what I'm taking away.
Would you be able to answer that, Kevin?
And I would say that under traditional Brown Act noticing requirements, yes, there's a risk, right, to noticing your home if you believe it to be inaccessible. And so there's a certainty and a safety, obviously, in utilizing a public facility that is, known to be sufficient in that capacity. Yes.
So I'm
Vice
just,
Chair. Yeah.
So I'm just commenting. I think we have to be careful that we don't give board members too many options.
Duly noted. So just, go ahead, Director Beltran.
Thanks. But Liz, I just want to say, I think that's if we stay with what we have now, but it doesn't look like that's the path that we're going. Or maybe I'm not clear, Kevin.
I don't have any deep insight, and perhaps, Benna, who's on the call, can speak to the legislative situation on the timing of any of this legislation or the potential timing for the relaxation of the state of emergency. And
Right.
that's where we're caught in well, let's just be prepared if that happens, of course. And so, we'd just like to make sure upfront, that we work with any member agency locations that you might be considering using daytime for committee meetings or evening. And that's, pretty much where we envision there being extra cost and staff time involved in keeping a facility open. And starting those discussions, surveying yourselves and the other board members to understand just who's in what space with regard to that. If you're comfortable coming in hybrid, we want to be ready to welcome you in Cupertino. And if you want to participate remotely from a accessible notice location, we want to support that too.
Okay. And then we will always have the option to come in.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So we got to wait and see what happens. Thanks.
Yes, there's Bennett, did you want to speak to the legislative situation? I know it's a
Sure. And maybe I could just clarify a little bit. I think as long as the governor's state of emergency is in place, we can continue our current practices until January 1st of 2024. I think the consideration is if the governor were to decide to remove that state of emergency, then we're sort of back to the original rules. And the pieces of legislation that Kevin covered, none of them are urgency pieces of legislation. So if they are signed this year, they would go into effect January 1st of 2023. So I think it is good to have some backup plans just in case the governor rescinded his state of emergency, and the legislation has not yet gone into effect.
Thank you for that. Let me make a comment, then I'll bring it to you, CEO Balachandran. Benna, I don't have great faith in a lot of fast legislative work, but we did see something very recently with UC Berkeley and their enrollment cap, and they turned on a dime. So I have a strong feeling that once the emergency declaration looks like it's about to go, people are going to look for something because there's a lot of power to what we've been able to do here. So I'm just guessing. Do you feel there's that they could zoom into action, so to speak?
Absolutely. And we see that all the time when state legislative leadership and the governor are aligned on something and want to move quickly, they absolutely can. I will say that in some of these bills that were introduced last year that would relax some of the Brown Act rules, there was quite a bit of opposition from groups like the ACLU who were concerned about public access. So these bills can be controversial, and that's why several of them did not make it through the legislative process. So I would just add that as, there's an active conversation debate at the legislature. And these bills, two of them are in the local government committee. One of them is in Senate Judiciary with a hearing date in early April. So we'll start to see some action happening very shortly as well here.
Okay, well, very interesting to see just how opposition might emerge given our experience, because I don't know what you've experienced in your cities, but I believe we have much greater public interaction. Granted, it's a bit different than we did in the in-person environment because of the accessibility. So before I head it back to the CEO, let me just kind of summarize what I'm picturing I've heard here today, and that is there's no distinction between our board meetings and our committee meetings. The SVCE is willing to offer some additional support, although it's quite likely that we shouldn't need it, but we don't know that. It's advisable that members, if they connect remotely, they do that from a public location, and a city facility sounds like a very good one. I'm actually sitting here thinking, and I think you kind of answered it, Kevin. See, Vice Chair's community center is about the same distance from my house as my city hall, and I'm thinking I could join her, even though she didn't offer to and meet. I don't think there's to be any barrier to that. And then it's just one notice in one location. Is that a fair comment?
I would say that's an option, and I would certainly consult with our vice chair as to how feasible that might be.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Thank you. A lot of factors to consider.
She wants the veto. And so the other thing that's interesting is I'm just speaking for myself, given my distance from Cupertino, my desire I would very likely attend our board meetings in person. I would want to do that. It's good to have an option. The thing to consider is if it's in the evening, I might require help from the city, at least in terms of access, opening up, getting inside the building, turning off the alarm. I've set off their alarm once before and they don't like that. And so then our daytime committee meetings, the thought I have, and it's related to Director Gibbons, is we don't have a lot of space. And so I need to come up with a plan working with my city if I start scheduling an office space to make sure that they have that. But that's something I can do myself. So that kind of summarizes some of the things I've gathered from your presentation so far. And so I'm going to hand it to our CEO and Director Martinez Beltran. Is your hand still up, or is that left over? Okay, so go ahead, Girish.
Thank you, Director Tyson. So just to provide a little bit of a summary in addition to what you said, it's essentially, this is like if then, right? If this happens, then. So there are several uncertainties. And I think the fundamental thing that we are looking at is we want to be prepared. We don't know exactly how these uncertainties will be resolved and when, but essentially the things we are doing to be prepared are, if there is a need to provide support for board members to attend remotely, we'll be prepared to do that. TBD on what exactly that would be, whether it's technology, dollars to cities to open the buildings up, etc. So we've got a lot of ideas that we'll take down from you to make sure that we'll be able to run these meetings smoothly, whether it's remote, hybrid in the Los Altos location, Cupertino location, Sunnyvale location. So that's all I had on the summary. I wanted to ask you, we'd like to discuss this with the board and bring this to the April board meeting. So that would be a next step that we want to get the head nods from you on.
I'm seeing head nods. Am I? Oh, I'm seeing head nods and a Director Gibbons comment.
I would just offer that we try and make the presentation a little simpler. There were too many options coming across, just.
Okay.
Sounds good. Happy to do that.
It sounds like that's a general consensus. Let me turn it over to the public and see if there's any public comments on this topic. I don't see any hands raised. Let me just also add that, another thing that I've seen is the power of the way we've been doing it now is people have been able to travel and so connect from, say, a hotel. And I think it would be a general comment to say your hotel would likely be ADA accessible. And so that would be a reasonable option. That's a fair statement, Kevin?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Great. With that, I think we've had a good discussion and some advice. And so I'm ready to move it on to item number 4, which is the Member Agency Energy Resilience Grant update. And we've got a staff presentation from, is that Zoe?
It is.
Great.
Okay. Wonderful. So I'm going to provide just a status update on our Community Energy Resilience Grants program. And go to the next slide. So some background. The board approved $5 million in investment in community energy resilience as part of our 2020 customer relief and community resilience package. So first, that's just really exciting. We're the one CCA who has gone beyond planning to actually provide grants to install decarbonized resilient solutions. And this year before fire season, we're going to get to highlight a number of really innovative projects that I know other communities will learn from. So that's a thank you for your leadership. These funds were combined with an existing program allocation that we had set aside of $150,000 to create a combined total of about $5.15 million. Next slide, please. Objective today is really to provide a status update on where each grant application is, to give you just some visibility and answer any questions that you have. Next slide. So to get into a little more detail and summarize what this program is that we divided that $5.15 million into planning support and to capital projects. So if you remember, this was right after COVID had broken out, and we wanted to provide money right away for cities who had projects that they were looking to move forward. And we also wanted to provide longer term planning support and support for jurisdictions that maybe didn't have a project defined and wanted to leverage analysis and planning support to prioritize their projects. So then those planning funds we divided further into a regional planning bucket, which will be we're in the process of finalizing our energy resilience framework that provides overarching principles and goals that apply across our jurisdiction and will help kind of guide how we think about resilience going forward, as well as some tools and technical assistance for our member jurisdictions. And then planning grants. And the planning grants will go into the details of how they can be spent, but I want to say one of the things that we did, we heard from our member agencies, great analysis, planning support, but we don't want to have to do an RFP process. We want to be able to move quickly. And so SVCE contracted directly with Borough Happold, and we're able to basically provide those planning grants. The cities let us know, we work out a task order. There's not a lot of logistics involved, so we can get that analysis going quickly. I mean, sometimes the process takes 2 weeks when the consultants can start. Next slide, please. Okay, so the funds were allocated based on load by jurisdiction. So you're seeing over here, this table provides the combined total grant for each jurisdiction. Roughly, the grants are broken out in about 20% towards planning and 80% for CapEx. Jurisdictions can choose to roll their planning funds, some or all, into their CapEx if they chose. So as an example, the city of Milpitas already had projects identified, so they used it right, all of their CapEx funds. City managers sign the grant application, which is a really simple grant application, but we wanted to make sure that there was, broad jurisdiction visibility into what each city was applying for. The deadlines are that the planning funds need to be spent by the end of this year, and the CapEx funds need to be spent by the end of next year. And I mentioned that Borough Happold is available as the planning consultant. Next slide. So the requirements, how can you use these grants? So the goals are intentionally flexible. We recognize that each jurisdiction is maybe in a different state of planning, has different needs. So we wanted to also experiment and see, be able to learn from what types of projects are most readily available and best for each jurisdiction. So on the planning side, this can be, detailed building level site analysis. It can be a building portfolio audit of all of your municipally owned buildings to say, okay, which buildings should we prioritize? Could also include things like community outreach. So if you wanted to do some planning engagement support ahead of fire season or related to what community members should do during an outage. It also could include things like an urban heat island reduction strategy. When we did conducted the vulnerability analysis, what came up is that really what the largest climate impact to our region is going to be increased heat. The way that our cities are planned and designed can either exacerbate that effect or reduce it. And so if your city was wanting to learn more about which particular areas of your jurisdiction or which particular building or design types are exacerbating urban heat, or what kind of strategies you could deploy, you could use the funds for a project like that. Internal coordination. So if you wanted to have coordination between public works and community planning on how to work when a large power goes out. And then also resilient hub planning. So this is the concept that of public locations, often libraries and schools, can serve as resilience hubs, right? So when there's no emergency in place, it's a place where the community comes, they can learn, but then when there is emergencies do happen, they can act as cooling centers, they can act as a place for people to come and charge their phones. So if there's often an important community planning process that goes into that. On the CapEx side, the broad umbrella is that these need to be zero carbon capital projects that reduce the likelihood or the impacts of power outages. So some examples there would be setting up a solar system to be resilient. We all know most of the time, most standard solar systems, when the power goes out, the solar goes out. But it can be planned so that there are switches so that, and if the building is optimized, if that power went out, you'd still be able to access or to leverage that solar when it was producing energy. Solar plus storage projects, or if there's already solar at a building, adding battery storage. An EV truck for backup. And actually we have, this is the county, they're going to use their funds for a solar EV charging system, and then a different department is purchasing an EV truck. And the idea is by combining these two things, the charging is available when the power goes out. That EV truck can actually be used to go to wherever the power outage might be, or go to that critical community site during an outage and provide charging for phones, for other types of kind of emergency equipment, refrigerators, those kinds of things. Urban cooling strategies. I talked a little bit about the planning side of this. If there actually were strategies you wanted to implement. Off-grid EV charging. So we have 2 jurisdictions actually that are purchasing chargers that are powered by solar. Also for something like building optimization. One of the things that we've learned in this process, not probably surprisingly, that a lot of city buildings are old and they might be not that efficient. And so slapping a battery onto an inefficient building isn't going to get the optimal results. And the first step might be to kind of invest in some efficiency, to invest in some smart controls so that you can really optimize that building to best use the solar that might exist, and in the future, maybe add in a battery as well. An important piece here too, that so far all of our cities have used, or all of our jurisdictions are requesting funds at a jurisdiction owned facility. But if that wasn't the goal, you could also use them at any kind of critical community facility. For example, a school, a library, even if there was a medical facility or a nursing facility that you wanted to collaborate with. This is an opportunity. The key thing is that the city decides where the funds are spent. Next slide, please, Andrea. Okay, so we have 5 jurisdictions that have allocated all of their funds. Los Altos Hills, Milpitas, Monte Sereno, Saratoga, and Sunnyvale. As you can see, each of these are in slightly different phases of the project. And 4 of the jurisdictions have battery storage as the foundational project. Saratoga is doing a project that focuses on batteries at traffic lights. I love this because it was an idea that they came up completely on their own. It's really pretty foundational to resilience. And then Sunnyvale is, in addition to the battery storage, they're purchasing a resilient EV charger. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Yeah, it's showing.
Oh yeah, there goes, just a little delay. So a lot of really, I think we skipped a slide,
You
actually.
skipped the second.
Oh yeah, there we go. I was thinking, good, I think this is the meat here, okay? Now, there's 8 agencies that have funds remaining. And so I will say you can see there's a few where the grants have not been submitted yet, or the application has not been submitted yet, for Gilroy, Los Altos, Los Gatos, and Mountain View. In some of those instances, for example, Los Gatos and Mountain View, I know they have identified a project yet. They're still working through the feasibility to actually apply for the grant. We have met one-on-one with all of our jurisdictions to make sure that the staff has a good sense of the broad overview, that there's staff that are engaged, and will continue to do that, those meetings. But we wanted to also make sure that everyone here has visibility, and if you have priorities or questions for staff, that you'll know what the status of your grant and funds are. Next slide. So again, a lot of success. Again, we're really excited about the projects that have moved forward. We want to also be clear that there are some challenges that have come up, and as I mentioned, we'll continue to work with jurisdictions to overcome these challenges. One is the battery and component costs have risen. So we've heard in some instances as much as 50% the component costs have risen. So making it possibly sometimes infeasible once that project was identified to actually move forward. Most jurisdictions don't have pre-identified resilience priorities. And so that then requires some additional internal coordination to really figure out how they want to address their funds, and that we're noticing can take a fair amount of time. Some jurisdictions may need additional planning support. We've heard that, to say, maybe can we do more with the planning grants instead of the CapEx grants? This one related to that top bullet, but even more generally, like particularly for the solar plus storage projects, our grant funds may not cover all of the funds, and so jurisdictions are looking for additional funds to ensure they can accomplish the project. And then here we want to say there, I think whenever you can roll analysis and planning support into a CapEx type project, I think there's a strong desire to then use all of those funds for steel in the ground or wires in the walls, because it's rare to get those funds. But there is a bit of a risk there that if you could miss key opportunities, or we see with batteries that they really need to be set up in an optimized way to make sure you get the benefits that you're expecting from them. And so not using those planning grants, does carry some risk, both in terms of time and optimal use of the funds. Next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide. And so our next steps, I mentioned, we'll continue to work one-on-one with jurisdictions, as well as we just presented at the MOG. We are releasing a decision support tool that can help jurisdictions who have not yet prioritized a facility, but also can help over the longer term to continue to think about energy resilience. We'll be conducting educational webinars specifically for member agencies, kind of combination of technical assistance and member agencies. We polled city staff to ask what topics they wanted and designed the curriculum based on their needs. We also are in the process of thinking through how to update the application timeline to provide a clear deadline. So when we designed the project, we designed it based on the spend by date, way out in the future. But we're at the point now where we want to make sure that there's enough clarity so that each jurisdiction can really spend their grants before the program runs out, and also before our contract with Borough Hatfield runs out. Folks might recall we did extend the deadline once by a year, the full deadline. And so we're thinking right now that probably mid-May would be when we'd want to have the applications in for either a planning grant or a CapEx grant. And then, we want to consider the process if for some reason all of the funds go unspent, or some of the funds go unspent, how we could use remaining funds in a way to still maximize benefit. So we had some conversations with our member agencies at our MOG meeting, and we're thinking through that process should that come to be. And those are my slides, so I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Not seeing any yet, I will just go ahead with mine. And so procedurally, if people run into the deadline of the end of this year for their planning and they shift everything to CapEx, then they have they could always use city funds to do the planning and return that CapEx. And I think it'd be fair to say you can't then ask for planning later next year and it's a one-way transfer, right? From planning to CapEx.
I think I understand the question. So let me just repeat it back to you to make sure. Saying if you move forward with a CapEx project now and then use city funds for planning, could you ask for reimbursement later for the planning portions?
I guess that's sort of what I meant.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. No, we wouldn't allow that. The way the planning grants work is it's specifically actually the consultant that we have hired does the planning analysis.
Okay, so because what I've learned from city government is people hate missing out on free money. And so I would guess that people, if they can't do the planning, they're going to move it all into CapEx and then find some way to use that. That's just what I would guess. And then my second question before I go on to Director Martinez-Beltran is, I saw the 4.7 million was the sum of all the cities, and I saw earlier 5.15 million. So what about the difference there?
Great, I'm very glad that you asked. that there's a portion of our overall budget always goes to evaluation and some to marketing. So that difference that you see when it's you see the big overslide, it adds up to 4.8 and then it adds up to 4.7. It's because some goes to the evaluation components.
I see. I see. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's move it to Director Martinez Beltran.
Thank you, Chair. Zoe, would you mind putting up that slide as we're just talking? I just want to grab that last number. And then, my question was, one of them, as you said, that there was some unspent, possibly some unspent dollars. How much is unspent at this point? And do we have an estimate of what we think will be? I mean, May's coming up shortly.
I was going to say it's unallocated. So some jurisdictions haven't, and I guess it would be on that next slide. And honestly, I haven't added up all of those funds. And this is a little bit like Kevin's presentation, is that it's an if-then analysis, right? We want to think through if there's a jurisdiction or some jurisdictions that don't use all of their funds, that we have a plan set up for using those funds. To Director Tyson's point, I think my sense is that jurisdictions still will find a way to use all of their funds. I think hopefully by providing some application deadline, that will help to maybe inspire moving forward now.
Okay. I asked because I see that we haven't used all of our funds.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like we've got about 40,000 still sitting there. If an agency hasn't used all of their funds, they're not able to complete a project with, the remaining hypothetically $40,000, what options would they have for that?
And Andrew, do you want to could you go to that? It's the slide that shows the 8 jurisdictions with the remaining funds. And so in the case of Morgan Hill, you've used your planning grant funds to conduct an analysis. And right now, the costs of the batteries for the project that Morgan Hill is considering have increased substantially. And so staff has not yet submitted the CapEx grant for that project. So I think there's some consideration if how to reduce the size of the overall battery project, or how to reconfigure the project a little bit so that it fits within the limits of the grant funding and also provides the benefits.
Okay. And is there any way to pair this with something in the future? Like this grant with another grant that might be happening in the future? Any kind of community resiliency we would do in the future?
We have seen, and I'm forgetting now which city it was, that would be pairing this grant with funds from outside. Absolutely. I guess the issue is if you haven't already identified those grant funds, if there would be time within the horizon of this program to get additional funds. But certainly there's no reason that you couldn't have matching, get matching funds.
Okay, I guess I'm saying, would there be any ability to do that within the scope of SVCE? So let's say they use this, which was from the 2020 resiliency, and then we have some other efforts coming up for, greening up the community. Would they be able to pair that with maybe a subsequent possibility in the future?
With a future SVCE grant or program?
Yes.
We do not have in our program roadmap plans for additional energy resilience grants. This was really one of our largest kind of direct grant programs that we have done, the full $5 million. So I don't know that we have plans for additional grants.
Okay. All right. I'll leave it there. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Director. And then we have the hand up for our Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for that, Zoe. So 2 questions, and of course, I noticed that Los Altos has not submitted an application. So my first question has to do with the identified deadline for the 2 different applications. Are those artificial deadlines just to incentivize cities to apply? Or if, for example, Los Altos doesn't submit an application, what happens to those funds if we miss that deadline?
Okay, so right now the deadline is around when the funds can be spent, and what we're right now working on to propose is exactly that application deadline. And I guess when you say artificial, is it an artificial deadline? It is somewhat artificial. However, the program really can't. We don't want the program to go on forever, and we've had the applications on the street for a little over a year. So we want to make sure if there's for some reason a jurisdiction says, and you know what, it's really actually just hard for me to spend this money, and we don't have a site that is city owned that makes sense for us to do this right now. So we don't want to. We aren't planning to spend the funds. I think that's really the conversation that would happen, where we would say, okay, let's put that money into a pool to be used elsewhere, versus we would say, oh, it's May 15th and your application isn't in, and so the funds are completely gone. I think that it's like, yes, we will have a deadline there, and we'll have some kind of grace period, presumably, if cities are actively working to identify a project. But if it comes to the point where, you know what, there's just not really a priority here within our jurisdiction, then we want to still make sure those funds can be used.
And I think that's a good segue to my next question, because, you know, as we all know, with a lot of these grants, you know, they look for shovel-ready projects, right? And so I can attest to the fact that we have many projects in Los Altos that I know could benefit from these funds. It's just a matter of identifying the project for the application. I have not seen what the application requires, but is that part of the application where we would have to specifically identify the project we want to use the funds toward? Because I can tell you, I think it's a combination of reasons why we haven't submitted the application, but it's definitely not because we don't have projects that could use the application or ideas that we would want to use those funds. So for the application, is it that we have to identify a shovel, like a project that's been approved or is moving forward or is somewhat developed? Like, what is that criteria on the application when it comes to the project?
Great. So for the CapEx funds, yes, you'd need to have a project defined, but you've laid out exactly why we have those planning resources available, so that the consultants can come in. They could help to simply facilitate a conversation. They could help to lay out, conduct kind of analyze. If you've got, okay, we've got these 4 projects, which of them should we actually invest these grants in? They could conduct that kind of analysis to help you determine how to best use the funds. And so that would be a planning grant. Say we want the funds to help you use these planning funds to really identify the project between these 4, or maybe a jurisdiction could say we haven't even identified 4 priorities. Can you come in and help us to prioritize?
Oh, so that's very helpful. So for the planning funds, we don't actually have to identify a project. It could be they're coming to help us identify a project.
Exactly. That's the foundational purpose of those funds.
Thank you. I thought it was after you identify the project, then they help you with the planning, but this is even great. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, very good. So next up is Director Gibbons.
Thank you. I'm thinking you have forms that cities submit. You have an agreement letter, you have forms for the planning and the forms for the projects. Could you include those in the attachments for the board presentation? I think that would be beneficial for all board members, and you can reference that in your presentation just and attach for your information. If you have an opportunity, put in a list of the contacts that you've made with each city, who's your primary contact in each city. I think that would help individual directors move things along within.
Great.
Great. I'm seeing a head nodding in assent about that being helpful to us. And then Director Martinez Beltran.
Thank you, Chair. Liz, that's an excellent point. I think that's fantastic. So, and then I just wanted to follow up and kind of circle back on the unspent funds. If there are any, and which hopefully there won't be, because it sounds like, you know, people just need to, they're just trying to identify what they're going to use. But if there are, it sounds like you're wondering, you know, what happens with that, and you wanted that to be part of this discussion. And I would just say, you know, maybe that could go towards helping some of these projects that weren't able to completely finish because of the increase in supplies due to COVID and everything else. If it could maybe go towards something like that, I think that might be a reasonable area to look at. So thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. And then let's turn it to our attendees. And by the way, I see we have 3 attendees. Tony, Bruce Carney, welcome, and alternate director Hung Wei. And do we have any comments or questions from them? Oh, I see a Bruce Carney, so go ahead, let's elevate him.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I wanted to make a comment related to something that Director Martinez Beltran had mentioned, the possibility that there was a worthy project, but that the grant funds were not sufficient to build it. And perhaps Mr. Balachandran can comment on what I'm about to say, because I'm not sure that my technical background is sufficient. But in terms of battery storage systems, it would seem to me that if you design something, let's say, that requires $500,000 worth of engineering and equipment and batteries, but you only have $250,000 to spend, you might very well be able to put in, you know, some fraction of the batteries you ultimately want and some fraction of what the system would be able to handle. And then as more funds are available in future months or years from whatever source, you could then procure additional batteries until you eventually have developed the resilient system to its full capacity. During the intervening times when it's not fully built out, it would provide some benefit, just not as many hours of energy as it will when it's finished. So that seems to be a way to deal with the fact that there may be some projects that exceed the budget available from this particular grant program.
Thank you for those comments, Bruce. And by the way, a number of us went to the ribbon cutting for the Slate project, solar storage, last week, and we saw many, not piles, but foundations for future batteries already in place for what in the future, either demand or just reduction in efficiency of batteries. So I think that's part of what Bruce is speaking to. So I leave it to you, CEO Balachandran, if you wish to comment on that. And so we'll just take that as a comment. Thank you, Bruce, for that comment. Bring it back to our panel. And this is for discussion only. So I think we've had a good discussion, and I hope that you as staff have gotten the feedback that you're looking for presenting to the total board. And then I see the vice chair has raised her hand again.
Thank you, Chair. And I think a member of the public, I actually think it's SV or newly appointed SVCE staff member with his hand raised.
Oh,
and I'll go after. So I do have a comment, Chair, but I saw that he had his hand raised.
Great. Let's go. We're going to go back to the public. And Tony, I think you've got something to say.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I just very briefly want to say Bruce is exactly right. And that's exactly how the Morgan Hill project is working, where the core grant is going to build the switching structure and the introductory batteries with an eye towards future funding, providing additional batteries. Thanks much.
Great, thanks for that info. And also, I'm always inspired to think, you know, in 2 or 3 years, the batteries will be better. Let's hope so. And so now I'll bring it back to the vice chair.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to comment that I support the concept of a grace period before we start redistributing the funds that aren't used. So I just wanted to make sure I endorse that idea. Thank you.
All right. Duly noted. With that, I don't see any further comments. And as this is for discussion, again, I'll just and make sure that I understand. I believe the staff got the kind of feedback they were looking for from this. Very good. And with that, I will close out item number 4. And we'll move on to committee staff remarks. And I will start by saying thank you, everybody, for shifting this meeting. Vice Chair and I have a State of the Cities at, well, for me, I have to start at 11 o'clock. So it turns out this is a shorter meeting, but we didn't know that. And so I appreciate everybody, staff and directors alike, for shifting to meet our schedule. And with that, do we have any other committee or staff remarks? I don't see anything. And so with that, I would say it's time to adjourn, everybody. I hope you have a very good day. So long.